All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to this Heterodox Academy virtual webinar where we will discuss trends, debates, and possible implications for higher education surrounding the rise of institutional statement neutrality policies that we've seen in the past couple of months. So the purpose of HxA's virtual webinar events is to give HxA members and fellow travelers a chance to learn about and discuss really important issues pertaining to open inquiry in higher education. So I'm Alex Arnold. I'm the Director of Research at Heterodox Academy's Siegel Center for Academic Pluralism. And before I introduce our webinar panelists, just a few housekeeping items. So let me first remind all of our audience here about some really important norms we aspire to uphold in everything that HxA supports and everything that HxA does, including webinars such as this one. These norms are encapsulated in something that we call the HxA way. So first, make your case with evidence. Second, be intellectually charitable. Third, be intellectually humble. Four, be constructive. And five, be yourself. So we really want to see active participation on the part of this webinar's audience. So please be sure to use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask questions, and we'll have someone who sort of sorts through those and surfaces the most promising questions for our panelists to discuss. And so one more thing before we meet our panelists. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to HxA's newsletter. Consider joining HxA's official Substack, Free the Inquiry, for juicy nuggets about open inquiry in higher education. And also, if you're a faculty, consider becoming a member of HxA. It's no cost to join. I should also say that HxA is present on all your favorite or your least favorite or most hated social networks. So follow us wherever you like to hang out on social media. And finally, let me just say that HxA is hosting its annual conference in Brooklyn, New York from June the 23rd through June the 25th this summer. Registration is now open. So if you're really keen to spend a few days hobnobbing with other open inquiry nerds and advocates, do consider joining us. So housekeeping items out of the way, let me now introduce panelists today. I'm joined by my colleague Erin Shaw, who is our crack research assistant and also co-author with me on HxA's new report detailing the trends in institutional neutrality adoptions. But I'm also delighted that we are joined by two very distinguished and eminent scholars. First with us is Robert Post, who is Sterling Professor of Law at Yale Law School and a past dean at that same institution. He specializes in constitutional law and the First Amendment in particular, and he has written many seminal and important works on academic freedom, including his 2009 co-authored book, For the Common Good, Principles of American Academic Freedom. And our second panelist is Victor DiRita, who is the Rudolph Hugh Endowed Chair in Microbial Pathogenesis, as well as chair of the Department of Microbiology, Genetics, and Immunology at Michigan State University, where he is also the co-chair of MSU's Heterodox Academy campus community. So gentlemen, thank you very much for taking time out of your, no doubt, very busy schedules to chat with us and our members about institutional neutrality. So, but to kick things off, I'm going to turn things over to Erin, who's going to share some highlights from the aforementioned HxA report on trends in institutional neutrality adoption. So Erin, take it away.
Thank you, Alex, for those introductions. Thank you, everyone, for being here again. And thank you, especially Professors Post and DiRita, for joining us today. So yeah, I'm going to give a really quick high-level summary of our latest report on adoptions of institutional neutrality across North America. So in short, we found that by the end of 2024, there was a huge increase in the number of adoptions of institutional neutrality across North America. 148 is what we found, and that's a really sizable increase from 2023. So the year prior, 2023, there were just a handful of institutions that had a known sort of public institutional neutrality policy. Now, as we all know, by the end of 2023, there was the escalation of a highly contentious and controversial um, conflict going on in Israel and Palestine, and university leaders were put under a bit of pressure to weigh in on an issue that was very complicated, and that was sure to alienate members of their community one way or the other. And it seems like over the next year in 2024, leaders took time to reflect on, as a Calvin report puts it, the role of the institution to be the home and the sponsor of the critics and not the critic itself. So, in short, nearly 150 institutions by the end of 2024 had embraced neutrality. Now, of these, 115 or 78% were public institutions, and adoptions of institutional neutrality at public institutions tended to come via governing boards or state legislators who required wholesale adoption across all public institutions in their state. That's the case in places like Utah and North Carolina. And then for the remaining 33 private institutions, it was more likely to be presidents who were drivers of adoptions of neutrality. And in terms of who is specified in these policies, in terms of who needs to refrain from weighing in on issues that do not directly affect the community, of course, all the policies clearly stated that the institution itself need not weigh in on issues that don't directly affect the community. But also, the majority also clearly identified university leaders like presidents and provosts, as well as half of these policies identified faculty speaking on behalf of the institution need to refrain from taking a position on controversial issues that don't directly affect the campus. And then, of course, the faculty, though, in their own capacity as individuals, are free to speak their mind and weigh in, but they just need to clarify that they are not speaking on behalf of their institution. And then finally, many of these policies, 29%, identified units, subunits, and departments as also needing to follow the policy of institutional neutrality. And we found among announcements that university leaders made when they were sharing with their community their new policy, there were several reoccurring themes. The biggest was community and inclusion. The overwhelming majority, almost 100% of these announcements reference community and inclusion as a reason for adopting such a neutrality policy, as well as free speech, academic freedom, public trust, and balancing the rights and responsibilities of institutions were also very, very common themes in these announcements of these policies. So with that high-level summary, I will hand it back to Alex.
Thank you very much, Erin. So I'd like to kick things off by posing just a very big picture question to our panelists. I'll start with Professor Post, and we'll go to Professor DiRita afterwards. But I'd love to hear your take on the rapid growth of institutional neutrality policies in higher education in recent months. I'm not looking for anything in particular, just, what is your take on it?
Well, I used to be a dean, and once you say something about one subject and one group, you create expectations you're going to speak on another group on another subject, and you very rapidly can paint yourself into a corner. So, from the point of view of the administration, it's always nice to be able to point to a policy in which you can say, I'd love to make a public announcement, but I just can't because we have this policy. So it serves as a form of self-constraint. And the rapid growth that Erin was talking about is obviously that after the Gaza conflict, university administrators were put into an impossible position. They had two constituencies, both of which were militant, and both of which could cause them trouble, and they didn't want to alienate either one. And the wisest policy in such a circumstance is to say nothing. And if you could, instead of saying, I don't want to say anything, you could point to a policy that gives a principled reason for it, you're in a better position. So I think universities tumbled all over themselves to create such a policy.
Mm-hmm. And Professor DiRita, what about your take on what we've just described?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, certainly gave institutions an out, if you will, to say we're, just like Robert said, we're not going to speak to this in an official position or official capacity because there's too many issues at stake on both sides. So I think that's part of it. I also think that we're seeing a kind of pendulum swing back to a sense that there are, in fact, different points of view on campus among the faculty and among staff members. And when an institution takes a position, it may exclude other points of view, irrespective of the concern that Robert just raised about, get us into concerning difficulties if we're taking a position. Just the understanding and the respect for that there are different points of view on all of these positions, I think, is becoming something that we're getting reacquainted with at the university. And I think that's a good thing. I have to say, I mean, I'm not shilling for heterodox, but I think it's been a value to have Heterodox Academy on campuses to help our administrators remember that there are different points of view on campus. And so when an institution takes one point of view, even on a, what we would consider to be a moralistic concern, it may alienate a lot of its faculty and staff. And so not taking a point of view is probably the better approach.
So I'm curious, both of you have served in leadership positions in your universities, Professor Post as dean and Professor DiRita as chair of your department. I'm curious if you have any personal, or if you'd be willing to share any personal experience that you've had in sort of navigating the waters of where various constituencies that you oversee are applying some pressure or urging you to sort of weigh in on a matter of social or political importance, and how you sort of reasoned about what your response should be.
Robert, do you have any? I'd be
Right. Well,
interested in your.
I was dean during Ferguson, and
Okay.
it was very strong pressure to do something about that. And I think one of the points about institutional neutrality, it's a subtle but actually very fundamental point, is that universities can never be neutral about their own mission. This was plain in the Calvin report, it's plain in all of these statements. So the university, qua university, is going to issue statements that are relevant to the mission of the university. And that can be quite controversial. So in the early days, and you have to understand, Calvin came out with a report in '67, and it was about disinvestment of the endowment, which today most people wouldn't view that as chilling one way or another. Academic freedom. But at the time, the president of Chicago wanted an excuse to say no to SDS that was urging disinvestment in South Africa. And that came up before the AAUP in 1967, big debate about whether or not we should have institutional neutrality. And in the end, it was decided it was too controversial, and no institution adopted any such policy for many years, almost 50 years. And then the Goldwater report came out, Goldwater Institute came out with a report 2017, which basically said there's an intrinsic contradiction between the academic freedom of faculty members, something like what Victor just said, and the university taking any position. And the University of North Carolina, I think, in 2022, was the first university to adopt the Calvin report after Calvin. And then the big spurt came from Gaza. And in the early days of this, a lot of people taking the position to revive the Calvin report said the university should never take a position on a controversial issue. But the mission of the university can be quite controversial. And you can't be neutral with respect to the mission. And a lot of the work about what it means for the university to talk or not talk is about, is it connected to the mission? So when I was dealing with the Ferguson, I authored a joint statement with Martha Minow, who was at the time the dean of the Harvard Law School. And we talked about rule of law and what it meant to be policing. And we tied that to the mission of the law school, which I interpreted and would still interpret to be, we're conservators of the rule of law. That's our job. We create it, we instill it, we inculcate it, and we strive to protect it. And so, in things about that, I would view as within the purview of the mission. And so was able to convert that into a statement about what we do in a law school and what, therefore, the goods we give society and why society needs those goods, the rule of law.
Yeah, it's an interesting, really interesting example from a law school perspective. So, recently, Robert brings out the Calvin report. It did speak to non-neutrality on issues that were directly impacting the mission of the institution. And of late, there's a sense with what's happening in Washington that the mission of the institution is under attack, and so we are concerned about that. And we had a recent discussion in my department about whether we should still be on X, or formerly Twitter, given the provenance of X and all that. And we had a very robust and very interesting discussion, and there was a lot of points of view on both sides of the issue. We determined that we were going to stay there, in part again around the idea that we want voices to be heard, and we want our voice to be heard, and we want our voice to be heard among people that maybe don't necessarily have the same points of view that we do, and that there are people on X that we want to hear what the mission of the institution is and why we think the work that we do is important, even though at the same time, one of the tenets of the Calvin report suggesting that we could be non-neutral is coming to the fore. The mission of the institution is under attack, so we shouldn't be neutral. So we want people to know what our mission is, and to hear what we do, and to, particularly in the field of science, where we feel there's some changes anyway at best going on in terms of how that gets done at the federal level with recent executive orders. So getting off of X would be a mistake. We wouldn't be talking to people that we think need to hear what's going on in our institution, what our students are doing, et cetera. So we stayed on it, but it was a good discussion. It was a robust discussion, and something that I didn't come into it myself with a strong opinion one way or the other, but I wanted to hear what a lot of other people thought, including people, for example, like our communications experts, who are, their job is to communicate. So I thought that was helpful, but having the opportunity for us to speak about it openly and not be concerned that one point of view was better or more important than another, I think is really important. I think that's the general sense of what institutional neutrality is all about.
Makes a lot of sense to me. One of the interesting questions that this raises is, what is the mission of the university? So we speak generally about research and teaching, and those are very abstract concepts. And it's one thing if you're a professor in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and you're studying biology or you're studying history, we have a pretty good sense of what it means to be an historian. But the modern research university has a lot of units which are very mission oriented in a different sort of way, like nursing school
Mhm.
and or public health school, whose mission might be to improve public health, or to improve nursing, the provision of nursing in on hospitals, or um, social work schools. So the issue of speaking about mission when you get to these different units becomes a really interesting issue about how to define what these are, because it's very different from, say, the German research university, where it's much more like the FAS, the traditional core of the American university, which had traditional disciplines. Like, I'm in law, and I just said before, our mission is rule of law, and that's generally for society. Someone in FAS wouldn't have a mission generally for society like that. So how this all plays out in the modern university with its many dispersed units. And remember, American public universities come out of the tradition of the land grant universities, where universities were created in order to provide service, say, to farms and agriculture, and to invent new ways to farm, to be of service to the surrounding communities. And that differentiates American universities from universities all over the world.
Yeah. It's an interesting point too, Robert, because again, I'm not trying to necessarily flack for HxA, but I find it a good organization. You guys just came out with this new magazine, Inquisitive. There's a really interesting piece in there by actually a close friend of mine, Erin Sousa, who's the dean of our medical school. And his piece essentially is entitled "We Have Never Been Neutral," and it kind of gets to some of the ideas, particularly at a land grant institution like Michigan State, where our medical schools were created really as community schools that were looking to support people who, have not had support in the past, rural groups, minorities, places where there's clear disparities, and then we can talk about where those disparities come from, et cetera, et cetera. So he makes a very logical case that we started with essentially a political virtue, and we can't stay neutral on that mission. And he makes a good case. I don't fully agree with everything that he says about it, but he knows that. But it's an excellent piece, and I think a really thoughtful one about what neutrality means at an institution like Michigan State.
So while we're talking about this, there's actually another essay in our new magazine, Inquisitive, which if anyone's interested, inquisitivemag.org is where you can access all of the offerings from that periodical for free. But the University of Chicago law professor Tom Ginsberg had a piece in there where he talks about what he labels undisciplined disciplines. And there are a few passages from this essay that are relevant to this discussion about how different units within the university can have different missions or missional emphases, right? Some of them are more purely research and teaching focused, but some of them have a mission that in substantive way connects up with societal concerns. And what he sort of recounts in that essay is the history of the rise of certain academic disciplines born out of the turmoil of the 1960s. And here I'll just quote. So many of the academic disciplines created in that period were born under a political star and rejected claims of technocratic neutrality in favor of promoting perspectives that had theretofore been excluded. Uh, Continuing on, these fields also became active agents of social construction and political mobilization, sometimes on an ethnic basis. And what I think he worries about is that here's another quotation, when one's scholarship is designed to include advocacy for political positions, what some have called scholactivism, the risks of such sorts of things are obvious, right? So the advocates can reject or downplay inconvenient results. They can distort academic debates. So anyway, I think the question about what the mission is and what might actually be, in a broad sense, politically legitimate missions that have enough of a base of support in society in order to be successfully carried out is an interesting question. And since both of you are in more professionally oriented schools, training medical doctors. Well, I guess Professor DiRita, you also do a lot of research, but your research has professional implications for the practice of medicine, right? And Professor
Sure.
Pope, of course, in the law school. I mean, this question about the mission of the university and the mission of subunits within the university, it becomes crucial in learning and figuring out how to apply these policies of institutional neutrality. And so I guess I would pose the question to both of you. Are there missions that a discipline or a school might adopt that are actually sort of beyond the pale in the sense that are sort of just if a discipline were just to assert that its mission was to advocate for the Republican Party's political agenda or the Democratic Party's political agenda, is that sort of beyond the pale, or how do we draw that boundary?
Well, for that question, institutional neutrality is the tail on the dog. I mean, the dog is what are we doing at a university?
Yeah.
That's a central question there, and it's a very complicated question because um, uh, many like a law school, our mission is to improve law, and you can't get away from that. So a mission that is connected towards social improvement, that this is very traditional part of many parts of the university. The departments that Tom talks about in that excellent essay are not in professional schools. They're not in these more peripheral departments, but in the heart of the university itself, in the what I would call faculty of arts and sciences. Different schools have different names for it. And that's a question ultimately for the faculty of arts and sciences to determine what the mission of their different departments are. There's a wonderful historian of this, of academic freedom and other things at Berkeley named David Hollinger, who has written that the way in which this discipline is exercised, and part of what modern universities do is they cede a lot of deference to departments to make judgments about what they're doing, what excellence is in a department, etc. But there tends to be review by allied departments. If I'm in law, the people in political science are looking at my work, or the people in economics are looking at my work, and so on. Each department has allied departments that review, and it has to be credible within the larger um, so concentric circles that constitute a university. And any administrator worth their salt knows when a department in a university has gone rogue, and it's your job to straighten them out. And that's a tough job that an administrator has, but everyone knows that that can happen, and that's part of your work. And you know that it's rogue by the judgment of the professionals who are in allied concentric disciplines. That's the cues that will begin to fill you in.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question and a thorny one. One of the things he also talks about in that article is the fact that disciplines can have a tendency to enforce a sort of point of view within that discipline, right? And that's kind of what we think of as a discipline. You this or that. But we also want there to be breadth within that discipline for dissent and for, particularly in the sciences, and we hear this term a lot, the consensus, a point of view. I mean, science is constantly pushing against the consensus because we're trying to discover, and we're always trying to discover. We used to have something in my field of science and molecular genetics, something called, of all things in the 50s, it was called the central dogma. And we now know, like many other dogmas, not to be quite what we thought it was, and now we talk about it differently. So we have to be careful about enforcing dogma within disciplines, and I think that he touches on that as well. And I'll give you an example from my own experience, which is we're at 5-year point of thinking about COVID, having been 5 years ago this week, shutting down for COVID. Within a pretty short amount of time, within a year, we were starting to get different points of view about exactly how best to deal with this, which were not listened, or we're not to say not listened to, but which were challenged as not just different points of view, but wrong points of view. And I think that's a problem. I think when you have people, and we're not talking about the flat Earth society versus the round Earth society. We're talking about what's the best way to control a pandemic, and are there different ways to think about it? And we very quickly got away from thinking about different points of view to, we have one point of view and this is how it has to be. I think that's being reevaluated now after 5 years, and that's good. But I think that's partly why we don't want institutions to take positions. We want individuals to have the freedom to explore different positions, again, within, boundaries, no question, as Robert just pointed out. But I think we have to be cautious about discipline enforcing lack of dissent.
So we've
The
got
term discipline has a root, right? So,
Well, John Dewey, when he defined academic freedom, he said it's the difference between being discipled and disciplined. So you don't want to be discipled because you don't want to reproduce
yeah,
exactly what the other person had, but you have to be disciplined in
yeah,
the sense that if you're dissenting and you need dissent, it
yeah.
has to be a dissent that's intelligible to someone who's articulate in the discipline. It's not anything goes. So
It's not anything goes. Yeah,
it's disciplines exist in this space where both there is a discipline and there is dissent and there's dissent, and someone has to survive in that very complex space. It can't be antinomian, it can't be anything goes,
yeah,
and it can't be discipling.
yeah.
Unlike freedom of speech, which is anything goes.
Right.
So I'd like to take a question here from our audience here. So in real terms, does the neutrality adoption serve to encourage civil discourse of complex topics, or does it de facto silence discourse or engagement by higher education institutions? And I'd love to have you guys, our distinguished panelists here, sort of weigh in on this issue. Like, what's your take on this question?
My view is anything 90% of what a university is going to want to be saying is connected to the mission, one way or another. And if you can't connect it to the mission, it's probably doubtful whether you should be talking about it. So it could be used, and it is being used by many universities to impose discipline from the center. That is to say, the presidents are imposing on department chairs or heads of centers or whatever. So you do see that. That's a real development, I think, which didn't exist before. When I was dean, I would think to go to the president before I'd make a statement in public. Now I'm guessing there are going to be all kinds of restraints in place because the consequences are so high. So there is an internal discipline, but if a university needs to speak up about something, it's probably because it's connected to something important to the university, and therefore comes under the mission exception. And in any event, it should always have been the case that universities should be very cautious about speaking about things unconnected to their mission. And that goes to the fact that academic freedom, which everyone in a university has an interest in preserving, is really a bargain that universities strike with the outside society. We provide certain goods to society, we provide knowledge, we provide education, and in return, they leave us alone to provide those goods and services. So academic freedom at root is professional self-regulation. And professional self-regulation is always very tentative. It's greatly under threat now in many states like Florida. But for the most part, we have been successful. Lawyers are not successful in professional self-regulation. But every time you speak out of turn, you're putting that bargain at risk, because why should we have no special expertise in speaking outside of our mission? And so we put at risk that bargain. So one, at a minimum, needs to be really careful about doing any such thing.
Professor DiRita, you.
I'd like to think that having a position where the institution isn't going to take a stance on something that people within departments or on campus or at the coffee shops are talking about, and therefore, if the institution said something official one way or the other, it might stifle those discussions. I'd like to think that having a stance on neutrality, like what we're talking about, will open up discourse so that people feel comfortable to say if their point of view is different than other people's points of view. I think that's what we need more of and not less of on campus.
Yeah, and I also want to suggest something that's a bit tangential, but it's sort of anecdata from my own time in academia. But I think um, there's a sense, particularly with more junior colleagues, that they need to feel like somewhat validated by superiors in order to like pursue certain lines of inquiry. And of course, like administratively, you need the funding, you need the okay, like of course, but there's something like a little more there about sort of like losing a bit of separation between the individual and the workplace, and then becoming very combined in this sort of like bring your whole self to work sort of idea, which is like a little bit more common with different people. And so I think there's just this like need to know that, oh, my institution supports me, and which of course, but it's more than support. It's like validate, agree, and so on and so forth, which I think is not ideal, not an ideal development.
That's never been a big virtue in the Ivies.
Yeah, it is true though, Aaron. I think that there is a sense among it's not just younger faculty members. I think it's just the era and the time that people want to feel that their points of view are valid. I think it comes from all kinds of sources, including social media, likes. I mean, we've all seen the data on, getting a like and getting something, validating makes you feel good. And so people want more of that. And I'm concerned, I'd be mostly concerned with it. And I've seen it sometimes of situations where somebody feels like they can't move their scholarship forward unless they have validation from some higher authority outside of the discipline expectations, as Robert was pointed out. And that's something that I would very much caution any younger faculty to worry about. I mean, what's important is that you're making progress in scholarship in your field and you're respected that way. And you shouldn't need me or anybody else to disagree or agree with your political points of view. It's not something that should matter. But and at the same time, have your points of view. I mean, I'm all in favor of that.
So yeah, we have a question here that sort of asks about actually whether social media, the rise of social media, has maybe heightened the need for institutions to embrace something like a neutrality policy. So it seems like, Professor DiRita, maybe your answer is yes, but I'll let you, both of you, have a chance to weigh in on this issue about social media and institutional neutrality.
I agree with what you just said. My answer is yes.
Yes. Professor Post?
Yeah, it's lowered the threshold for, making a mess.
Yeah.
Good way.
So, Professor Post, we have a question here that's just curious about what if you could share what you said in your statement about Ferguson. I mean, that's 11 years ago now. It's
I
kind of
can't
wild.
remember. I mean, it was something about rule of law and the need for police to follow. I don't. I mean, it was something pretty anodyne. But it was basically a statement in support of the students in the school were feeling unbelievably threatened, and that was true at Harvard, it's true as here, and wanted to do something that showed solidarity with them. But that connected it in a mission way without being political, and so that's something that we crafted together to do.
Right.
I'd have to look it up. I can't remember.
Yeah, so there's actually a subtle but important point here, which is that it's one thing to issue a statement on a social and political issue. It's yet a further step to actually take a stance on a social or political issue. And it sounds, at least from your description, Professor Post, that you did the first thing. It's not necessarily clear that you did the second thing, which is you sort of,
In law, it's a very, that may be a difference without a difference. So like, I write an article and I say, the court got it wrong.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I'm taking a stance or taking, I mean, I'm doing both, obviously.
right. Yeah. Okay. Well, we got some other questions here that are bubbling up from our participants. And one question here is actually from a Canadian audience participant. So, writing from Toronto, we have no pushback on DEI and universities taking political positions, I think ostensibly in a very profligate sort of way. As a co-chair of an HxA campus community at the University of Toronto, they've met with bureaucratic intransigence about adopting institutional neutrality. And do either of you have any suggestions for how we can persuade universities in Canada to see institutional neutrality or institutional restraint as a net positive? So maybe Professor DiRita, you were involved with MSU's push to move toward institutional restraint. Maybe you have some practical advice to offer on this subject.
Well, I mean, again, I think the fact at our institution, we were pushing on an open door. I mean, it was a movement already at our institution when we started to, move. Now we haven't talked about this. Our position officially is institutional restraint, not neutrality. So it's a little bit of a difference. I'd be interested in hearing Robert's point of view on that, because then he said Yale is in the same position. But I think the fact that there was so much, kind of groundswell already of faculty feeling like, hey, we need something here that's a little different. The people are starting to feel like, they don't want to censor their own thinking and speaking because of positions the institution might be taking. And I think that that's something that our administration understands. We also, and it's interesting to hear about North Carolina, because we have a new president here, Kevin Guskowitz, who came from North Carolina, University of North Carolina, and I think he brought some of that mindset with him as well. We also, there's just a lot of ferment here about how, about freedom, free speech, and civil discourse on campus. This also happens to be the home of Alex Drager from Heterodox Academy. And so I think a lot of this is just bubbling up, and that made a huge difference, I think, with the institutional point of view.
Professor
So,
Pope, do you have
so
any
my own, I mean, just think about this difference in institutional restraint and whatever. My own, I come at this from an academic freedom point of view. And my position has always been, if anyone speaking for the university or speaking in an official capacity speaks in a way that shows the academic freedom, it's wrong because it shows academic freedom. You don't need to say anything about institutional neutrality. It's no university official should speak in a way that chills academic freedom. Full stop. You don't need to say anything more or less than that. I don't. I can imagine. Other than that, universities should be able to speak in ways that their payoff matrices suggest in any given situation, so long as it doesn't chill academic. That's a side constraint, and that's a strong constraint. They should never do that. But other than that, who knows? What the benefits or the detriments are to a university about speaking about a thing. It's a hypothetical question, and one of the things they teach us in law is to stay away from hypothetical questions. So, as a general matter, I should say the thumb should be on the scales against doing it, because as a general matter, it's going to weaken the claim to professional self-regulation. But I can't see the theoretical claim that if the payoff matrices is sufficiently good, you shouldn't do it. That I can't see, if assuming, of course, it doesn't violate academic freedom. So for me, that's perfectly proper, so long as the person in charge understands, as a matter of prudence, what the costs and what the benefits are, and is clear about that.
Yeah. So to our Canadian friends at the University of Toronto, this question actually is a little bit puzzling to me because I'm looking at a memo here dated April 26, 2024. I'll drop a link in the chat where it sounds like the University of Toronto adopted something akin to institutional neutrality or institutional restraint. So I guess you can peruse the memo I just dropped in the chat and correct me if I'm wrong or wave it in front of whatever functionary you're speaking to as sort of leverage for a case. But yeah, so I'd love to hear more about what's happening at the University of Toronto. So you can email me at arnold@heterodoxacademy.org. I'd love to get an update on what's going on at the University of Toronto. So let's go through some other questions here. We do have a kind of follow-up on the discussion that we had very briefly about undisciplined disciplines or activist scholarship. So the question is, does the principle of neutrality require colleges to stay neutral on the question of activism and refrain from punishing or attacking scholars for being political activists? Like, I haven't answered this question, but I'd love to hear what Professors DiRita post that.
The question is absolutely, it must remain neutral. Academic freedom has four flavors. There's freedom of research and publication. There's freedom in the classroom or of teaching. There's what we call freedom of extramural speech and freedom of intramural speech. Freedom of extramural speech is the freedom of the professor to speak as a citizen, which is to say, in your terms, as an activist about matters outside the university. And if you look at the academic freedom cases that have arisen since, say, academic freedom was invented in the United States, in its American version, say, the 1915 Declaration of Principles of Academic Freedom, written by Arthur Lovejoy and Edwin Seligman in 1915, I would say the majority of those cases involve professors who were outside of the university speaking as citizens, and the university didn't want them to speak in that sort of way. And so most people don't have the civil right to speak as they wish. Their employers can punish them if they speak in ways that embarrass the organization or their employment. You see, you see that happening in the federal government right now. And but as a university professor, it's part of it's an essential and very much respected component of academic freedom that you have that right. It's enshrined in the 1940 statement, which is in most of the contracts that professors sign when they say with their employer that they have academic freedom.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I don't think that a faculty member should be concerned if they are speaking if they are speaking in ways that are protected by the First Amendment for free speech, that they should be come under assault at the university because of their scholarship or somehow being viewed as their speech being somehow disconnected from their scholarship. Their speech is their speech, and they have a right to speak it. Again, we're not indentured to our universities.
There's one qualification which, when they first said this in 1915, and again in 1940, they said, but the professor has an obligation to speak as a qualified professional, blah, 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 blah. It was very qualified. And that became undone in 1970. It's a famous academic freedom case with Angela Davis at the University of San Diego. And then they wanted to fire her for speeches that she made as a political activist. And the qualification was you cannot fire someone or discipline them for extramural speech unless it shows that they're incompetent in their job as a professor. So if you can make the case that the speech somehow shows that what you're doing as a professor, you're doing incompetently, that's a different issue. But the threshold for that showing is extremely high.
But is that pertinent to the speech that they had, or is that pertinent to essentially a performance review of their competence in their discipline and in their field? How does that work?
The second, it has to do with their competence. If they're speaking in ways that shows, take cod liver oil for measles, and they're in public health, that might be relevant to their competence in their profession.
Yeah.
So the question is what it shows about the competence, but very high threshold if it's extramural as opposed to professional publications and research and teaching. You see this come up a lot. By the way it comes up is I'm saying something very controversial outside, and then the students say, I can't be taught by such a person because they
Well,
believe X and they don't like me. So it's relevant to my ability to teach.
yeah.
And the threshold of doing that should be and is, well, isn't maybe, but should be very high.
It should be, and actually I think is part of what we're seeing too. Is I think that pendulum is swinging in the other direction, and people are just feeling like, wait, I can't have a point of view about something outside of my field or within as a citizen of the nation without students, tweeting it that I said something. So I think that's it's important to hold that principle. I think it's really
Yeah,
important.
it's a very important principle, I think.
Yeah, if I want to just emphasize something that in HxA's extraordinary U model of statement neutrality, that this is precisely something that we emphasize, that, you know, statement neutrality isn't just about institutions refraining from speaking, but it's also about certain positive obligations they have to foster rich, vigorous, and wide-ranging inquiry and expression about contested topics, and also the obligation to clearly, firmly, and consistently reject any calls to sanction faculty, staff, or students based on their viewpoints about contested topics. So I think that sometimes what sort of gets lost in the shuffle and of the debate about institutional neutrality and some of the criticisms I've seen about institutional neutrality policies have been, oh, this is just an effort, or, when adopted as it should be, it's just ends up in censorious administrators basically telling faculty to shut up. But that's actually not the point. Actually, to apply the policy in that way is to completely miss
Yeah,
the what institutional neutrality is for, and that is to actually unleash the bright minds on the faculty at these institutions to make their arguments, to express their opinions,
yeah,
and to silence them. And I think to the extent that policies that go under the name of institutional neutrality policies are instead being leveraged to silence faculty, to silence students,
yeah.
that they're just being misapplied entirely.
Yeah, I
So
don't even think it's so much. Yeah, well, there is a concern about an institution silencing. I think that part of the issue with neutrality is that we don't want people to silence themselves. I mean, people have right to speak their points of view and to share, viewpoints, etc. And if there's concern that if I do so, I'm going to get myself in trouble, so therefore I won't do so, that's a problem. And I think that that's partly what the institutional neutrality movement is about, to just open up and let viewpoints flourish.
So maybe Erin can help on this. I'm not sure, but my intuition, just kind of seeing stuff flow across the desk, neutrality is a kind of poor word to describe what this is about, because the university is always going to be making statements about its mission, as to which it can't be neutral, and that's 99% of what it does. So I've seen a lot of these policies now characterized as institutional voice, when that and how that should be exercised and not exercised, rather than neutrality. Is that your impression from these policies or not?
I would say there's a handful. Cornell, for example, just today is convening some sort of faculty. They announced today that they're convening some sort of faculty group to develop institutional voice.
Voice, yeah,
There's a handful of instances, but overwhelmingly it's referred to as
neutrality.
yeah, so just looking through our little data table here, it looks like so Harvard speaks in terms of institutional voice. Yale spoke in terms of institutional voice. Western Michigan University, which not included in the report that was published because they released their policy just this year. They talk about stewarding institutional voice. Um, while we're at it, I think this is an opportunity for us to maybe talk about the extent to which the use of neutrality versus restraint versus stewarding institutional voice, whether these are just like minor semantic variations or whether they really actually encode substantial differences. That of the term I've been using in an essay that I'm drafting and that might appear on our Free the Inquiry Substack is to instead talk about bounded advocacy, which is to say that universities can advocate for on behalf of their mission, but should really have certain boundaries set up around what that advocacy looks like. But yeah, I'm curious. So what we talked about this before the webinar kicked off, but is there a difference between talking about neutrality versus restraint versus stewarding institutional voice?
Well, in law, neutrality is often used in ways that are meant to excuse lack of responsibility, and it's a hard word in the legal context. It's often a word that obscures more than it illuminates. So, in the legal context, anyway, neutrality is not a favored word. I think what's important is to get the concept right, and the concept is stick to the knitting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, even the Calvin report talks about, the sort of the corporate capacity of an institution and, where it comes to, it owns something, as an institution, well, then it can speak to those issues. But I agree. I mean, I worry about the institutional voice movement. I've just started to pay attention a little bit to it because it sounds to me like it's a kind of a slip back to, well, this is our voice and this is what we expect to be said with that voice, which then sort of implies things that are expected not to be said. And so that's what I'd be concerned about with those movements.
Yeah. So the concern here is kind of the connotation of different terms, perhaps in different contexts or across contexts.
Yeah.
So, uh,
I like stick to your knitting. That's a pretty good one if people would just pay attention to that. And the other thing is too that what the Calvin report discusses is that institutions, universities are made up of individuals, and individuals have a voice, but the institution. So that sort of gets to the stick to your knitting. That's an excellent way that we should think about this.
so, so we've got a question here that is pertinent to this motto of stick to the knitting. So how can we get academics to understand the key idea that using universities and other institutions as vehicles for activism causes the public to lose trust in them? Actually, I believe this is a sort of argument that you run at the end of your essay on institutional neutrality, Professor Post, and it's come up in our discussion when you talk about payoff matrices. But I'd love to hear you sort of maybe shed some light on how we can persuade academics to keep their powder dry, stick to their knitting, not
I've
try.
been running that argument now for 40 years, So I have a book called Race and Representation. It's about affirmative action, arguments for, arguments against. And the basic point at the time was that the university was making all kinds of social justice arguments, and it produced a lot of propositions. I was in California at the time that would, that stopped its ability to do that. In Michigan too, I think
Yeah.
you had initiatives like that. So you invite reprisals when you set yourself apart from the rest of society and appear to look down your nose at society and say, I don't care what you care about. This is what I'm going to do. And, we're in a delicate position. We have a position to conserve that we are susceptible to interventions which can undermine what we do. And we're seeing that right now. We're seeing it up and down. And it puts us in a terrible position. And if we get overconfident and if we think we can tell everyone else what to do or are exempt from the ordinary rules, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And so we just have to be really careful about that. And if we need to take a risk like that, and all I'm saying is I'm not ruling it out theoretically because I don't know what theoretically it would look like to rule it out. That's one thing, but you're going to be very careful before you incur that cost.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is that we saw this. I think Columbia got it right between the eyes. Federal funds come with federal strings, and it's the whole value proposition of Hillsdale College. We're not taking a penny of it. We'll have our own points of view, and nobody can tell us not to unless we're outside the boundaries of the Constitution or something. So I think exactly what Robert just said. I mean, institutions have to be very careful about that because it sets up this dialectic. If we say this, then somebody else will say something different.
Yeah, it's one thing though. Colleges can take that position.
Yeah.
Research universities
Yeah.
cannot take a position. We can't
Totally
take
different.
government money. And,
Yeah.
American universities became the cream of the crop in the world after World War II,
Yeah,
when the federal government began to invest in universities.
Yeah.
The original investments were in the physical sciences. Now they're in the biological sciences. And we can't do what we do. We can't be the best in the world in cutting edge research without federal funds.
Yep,
So
no
we are in
question
a
about it.
position of vulnerability, period.
Yeah, no, and it's a partnership we until 2 months ago we all thought we understood pretty well. That will produce a lot of new knowledge, and it's decentralized approach, and the federal government helps support the infrastructure to do that. And now that's under attack, and that's a big concern.
Yeah.
So let me just play, I don't know, devil's advocate just for a second here. But there is a fine line between prudence and, you might say, cravenness or cowardice, right? So, I'm just wondering what both of you might say to someone who objects to this kind of prudential argument that no, universities should have the courage to, speak up when matters of social and political importance arise. They have certain moral authority. They've got prestige they should leverage in order to advance various social goods. I mean, isn't what you're counseling just cowardice? Um, so I don't know. What would you say in response to that?
I'd say anyone who doesn't know the difference between cowardice and prudence shouldn't be leading any institution.
That's an excellent one. I agree, and also I guess it's sort of I'll go with the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. I have to see it to know what we're talking about. So if you're talking about what's the moral issue that the university must take a stand on, I want to know what that issue is because I would say the university's position should be this is something to debate and let's hear what the different points of view are on it and provide the forum to do that. Obviously, there are going to be that's a spectrum, right? There are going to be some that we don't debate this. This is just something we all agree on, but it's a hard thing for an institution to say these are the things that live within that rarefied space that we're just not going to debate and here's the rest and you should have at it. There's a lots of points of view. There are a lot of point of view, and what the university should do best is provide a place where people can explore those different points of view without feeling like if I say the wrong thing I'm in trouble.
So we've got time for one last question. I think this is an interesting question to cap our discussion off with. So it's got two parts. So what kind of a university mission statement would make it impossible to be neutral on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Um, and with regard to DEI, how could a university be neutral with respect to DEI in all of its various meanings, in the meaning that universities ascribe to it? So Professor Post, you mentioned that you'd written this book on affirmative action. It's kind of a predecessor of DEI in many respects. It is the occasion or the reason why the Trump administration is doing a lot of the things that it's doing with respect to higher education and elsewhere. I'm wondering, to what extent is neutrality the sort of thing like should universities be cut for reasons of neutrality, pull back on their invocations of the value of DEI within their missions?
Well, I mean, those are many different questions.
Yeah.
The first question, think about a historically Black institution. I'm guessing that diversity and inclusion is part of the mission of such an institution, and they arose in a certain context. They had huge social importance. They probably still do have huge social, and it's part of their mission. So, but University of Michigan can't say that. I mean, it's not a historically Black institution. So there will be institutions where DEI are going to something like what we would now call DEI would be part of the essential mission. One of the interesting things about the American higher educational system, it's that it's spectacularly diverse. In most countries, universities are government owned, and they're all species of the same thing. They all have the same mission. It's set by Paris, if you're a French public university, and your curriculum is set there, and they're all doing the same thing. America has huge numbers of mostly private universities that have different missions. Some are there to instill good character, some are there to instill classical knowledge, some are there to serve social justice. And that's up to the institution to decide what its mission is. And we have a market in higher education, and the different players in the market will market different kinds of missions. So that's important to keep in mind in the first place. In the second place, diversity and inclusion, insofar as it's connected to the mission, namely I need to have a diverse classroom if I'm going to teach, then that's an argument from the mission. And that's the position that Michigan took in Grutter. And that's defined by mission. And that's for the university itself to determine what its connections are. It's a state institution. The Supreme Court now has said that a state institution can't do that, and an institution that takes Title VI monies can't do that. So you can't do that mission anymore, defined that way, says the Supreme Court of the United States. So, but that's a constitutional ruling. That's not a ruling from internal to a university. That's from an external saying you can't do that anymore.
I mean,
So
the problem I have with the question is that it goes back to my earlier statement, which is I don't know what's defined as DEI. I mean, I know what we say it is, but I don't think that the Trump administration has been particularly clear on what they mean by that. I don't think we've been particularly clear on what we mean by that. Does it mean that we want to like I was at Michigan when Lee Bollinger was making the case that diversity is the most important goal for a classroom education, the way that Robert just pointed out. Um, but are we talking about we want to have diversity in our classroom, or are we talking about the fact that we want to study disparate outcomes and only people who come from one group can do that? Those are two different things, and I think we've been woefully loose in our language on both sides of this issue, and therefore makes it very difficult to know exactly what we're all. It's like Justin said, if we don't know the terms and the issues, we don't know what we're talking. We can't have the discussion. I think that's what's happened with the whole DEI discussion. The
Deeply
Trump
important.
administration. I'm sorry.
Deeply important what you just said.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just think it's the Trump administration has been very loose with their language, and I think we've been loose in return.
The,
yes.
the Dear Colleague letter that the Trump administration says, I mean, rather blatantly overreads
Yeah,
or misreads SFFA, I think.
So, well, we're actually 1 minute over. So thank you to Professors Post and DiRita for staying with us one additional minute. We very much appreciate it.
pleasure.
It's a lot of fun. I learned a lot, and I've got a lot of stuff to think about. I'm sure my colleague Erin does as well, and our audience. So again, thanks for making the time to be here and to answer questions. Thanks to our audience for asking real interesting questions. Be sure to subscribe to Heterodox Academy's emails in order for information about future virtual webinars such as this one. And Robert and Victor, I'm sure you're Googleable. So
Yeah,
if anyone's curious to follow up on any of your work, we would encourage you to do that. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye now.
thank you very
Bye
much.
bye.